Thank you very much, Nelike. I'm really thrilled to be here at this special 15th edition of PINC. When I came in yesterday, the hotel manager was saying this is the only conference in the year where the organizers hug the staff, and I know I'm in the right place. Today I want to share a few words about empathy and what I call empathic action, a topic that's very near and dear to my heart with huge implications for society. Indeed, my goal is to make the case that we need an empathic action revolution if we are to survive as a species. But first, I want to give you a moment to answer a question. What is empathy? It's a word we're hearing a lot about these days, and with very good reason. But what does it really mean? I'd like to offer my understanding of empathy by sharing a couple of stories. A few years ago, I had the pleasure of traveling to Nebraska with a group of McGill students to meet with investment superstar Warren Buffett. It was a wonderful experience on many levels, but the most memorable part of the day for me was when he shared his thoughts about the ovarian lottery. This is what he said. Imagine for a moment a typical lottery machine, except in this case, there are exactly the number of balls bouncing around inside as there are people on the planet. 7 billion, plus or minus. And at the time you were born, one popped out with your life's lucky number on it. In other words, where on the planet you were born, to which parents and set of circumstances. He then asked, how many of you here today would be willing to give up your ball for a chance at a better one? I could ask the very same question of all of you, and my guess is that none of you would. That's because the odds of getting a better luckier number are overwhelmingly stacked against you. Warren Buffett's moral of the story is, with that kind of privilege comes great responsibility. In his case, this means donating billions of dollars, because he can imagine the hardships people face when they haven't won the ovarian lottery. He is responding to cognitive empathy. Now hold that thought for a moment. A couple of weeks ago, I had the pleasure of meeting a woman who manages all the volunteers for the 5 Montreal area hospitals. It's a job she refers to as a calling, and I believe her. I was interviewing her for my book and asked if she had any good stories that pull at the empathy heartstrings. She thought about it for a minute, and then tears welled up in her eyes as she told me about a volunteer who had participated in a special program offered at the neonatal intensive care unit at the Royal Victoria Hospital. The cuddling program, as it's called, involves volunteers cradling premature infants in their arms when they are not in incubators. One day, my interviewee received a call from an ICU nurse asking for a volunteer to take on a very special assignment. Just a while earlier, a woman had suffered a massive heart attack while in labor. Luckily, she and the baby survived. Sadly, it happened again. But incredibly, both survived. The mother-to-be ultimately met her destiny, however, and passed away after a 3rd massive heart attack. The baby, on the other hand, was still alive. But not for long. Given the trauma she underwent during the birthing process, she wasn't going to make it for very long, so the nurse was seeking a volunteer to cuddle the baby girl until she expired. The woman who took on this responsibility was known as a really tough cookie, but not wanting the baby to die alone, she cradled her for hours until her final breath. To this day, she says the experience was the most profound and sacred of her entire life. Now, if you're feeling the least bit moved by that story, you are experiencing affective empathy, a phenomenon that Hollywood filmmakers and Hallmark card writers understand very, very well. So to recap, you can either imagine yourself in someone else's shoes, which is cognitive empathy, or feel what someone else is feeling, known as affective empathy. And when these two phenomena come into alignment, the power of empathy is nearly unparalleled. Only love is more potent. Empathy trumps pity, sympathy, and even compassion, words that are often used interchangeably when they are far from synonymous. I situate empathy on an altruistic emotion continuum. On one side is pity, which is an emotional response to someone else's pain or misfortune. But pity usually regards its object as inferior and sometimes even with contempt, The bottom line is, when you pity someone, you look down on them. And unfortunately, a lot of foreign aid and plenty of philanthropy has been historically rooted in this paternalistic pity paradigm. So here's a little something to make that point clear. But as you make your way across the continuum from pity to sympathy and compassion, and ultimately reach empathy, that's where things start to get really interesting. Because when you empathize with someone, you recognize that you share a common humanity. Yes, we may all differ as a result of life's circumstances, which are largely dictated by the ovarian lottery system, but we are all inherently worthy as human beings. In his fabulous book, The Empathic Civilization, Jeremy Rifkin wrote, "Empathic extension is the only human expression that creates true equality between people. When one empathizes with one another, distinctions begin to melt away. The very act of identifying with another's struggle as if it were one's own is the ultimate expression of a sense of equality." And guess what? Recent breakthroughs in neuroscience have confirmed what the mystics and sages have been saying for millennia. That is, that we are all born with the innate capacity to empathize, regardless of race, nationality, social class, or age. Consider this. Our two closest relatives are chimpanzees and bonobos, both apes. And while they are remarkably similar as far as species go, more than 3% of the human genome is more closely related to either the bonobo or the chimpanzee genome than they are to each other. Dutch primatologist and empathy expert Frans de Waal has a lot to say about this. Voted one of the world's most influential people today by Time magazine, de Waal believes our understanding of human nature has been utterly inadequate and incomplete because we've spent the last 50 years studying chimpanzees. Based on behavioral observation with chimps, we believe that humans are competitive, hierarchical, and violent by nature. But more recent research with bonobos would lead us to conclude that we are innately cooperative, collaborative, and empathic. In fact, bonobos are known to resolve conflicts literally by making love, not war. Empathy philosopher Roman Krznaric writes, "Galileo shocked European society by demonstrating that the Earth was not at the center of the universe, with the sun and planets revolving around us. De Waal has revealed something just as revolutionary, that human nature does not simply revolve around self-interest. Empathy is at the center of who we are. Homo empathicus has roamed the earth for hundreds of thousands of years, and our task is to create the kind of world that enables, rather than hinders, the flourishing of our empathic selves." The good news is that just like we can build up our biceps by doing curls at the gym, we can become more empathic with practice. And in case this photo gives the impression that empathy is just for girls, I want to make it clear that boys and men can also become better empathizers with practice. Here's a way to think of the process. Imagine walking across a patch of land like this after a fresh snowfall. It would definitely be a slog because you're the one that's taking the first steps. Now, imagine you're the next person who wants to cross the same vista. In all likelihood, you'd follow in those footprints. And this would be repeated and repeated until which time there'd be a well-worn path, making it quick and easy to get across. Well, guess what? That's a simplified way of looking at how our brain operates. Breakthroughs in neuroscience have revealed that every baby is born with approximately 100 billion neurons, and over time they weave synaptic connections into a complex network of nerve pathways. This wiring takes place as a result of day-to-day living, and as one encounters repeat experiences over a lifetime, the denser the synapses become, much like the footprints in the snow become more entrenched with each passage. Empathy in humans harks back to neural circuits that emerged over millions of years of our evolutionary transition from reptiles to mammals. But it wasn't until very recently that we discovered the neurological basis for empathy. Here's how it happened. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, a team of Italian neuroscientists in Parma were conducting all sorts of experiments with macaque monkeys. One of their studies involved using hair-thin electrodes to investigate how a special group of neurons are dedicated to controlling hand and mouth functions. Literally by accident, the researchers noticed that some neurons in the premotor cortex were activated when a monkey watched one of the researchers pick up a nut, even though the monkey himself hadn't moved. His brain was responding as though he'd picked up the nut for himself. This discovery of so-called mirror neurons led to a flurry of research with other primates, birds, and eventually human beings. And these studies confirm the existence of mirror neuron systems in all the species investigated. A discovery so significant that the other researchers predict that mirror neurons will do for psychology what DNA did for biology. Of course, mirror neurons have major implications for the social sciences and the arts as well. For example, photographers do an excellent job of arousing our empathy neurons. Take a look at this image. There's no question about how this child is feeling, and his joy is literally contagious, especially the longer you savor his expression. Now here's a photo on the other side of the spectrum, purposefully painful and dramatic to make my point. Kevin Carter took this iconic photo of a vulture waiting patiently for an emaciated child to die. It was March 1993 in South Sudan. The photograph was sold to the New York Times and became a metaphor for Africa's despair. Carter won a Pulitzer Prize for it, but he was unable to enjoy the critical acclaim. Haunted by questions about the little girl's fate and why he didn't intervene, he committed suicide 3 months later. Carter was devastated by his lack of empathic action. Now, in addition to knowing that empathy is innate and that we can all become more empathic with practice, I'd like to share something else that's quite remarkable. It is estimated that the number of atoms in the entire known universe is equivalent to 10 to the power of 80. That's 10 followed by 80 zeros. In other words, a very big number. But not when you think about the 100 billion neurons that each of us has, each of which has approximately 5,000 synaptic connections. Because the number of possible combinations of 100 billion neurons firing is approximately 10 to a million. That's 1 followed by a million zeros. So in response to the deluge of stimuli we encounter every day, all day long, new neural pathways are being created and old ones are being deepened. Which means our brains are constantly changing. This is a process known as brain plasticity. Now, since we have the capacity to choose what to think about and for how long, we literally control our brain's transformation. Which begs the question, what would happen if we all began thinking more empathic thoughts? And perhaps more importantly, what would happen if we all started engaging in more empathic action? Now for my principal argument. Yes, leveraging the power of empathy is huge and real. But empathy alone is not enough. We must act on empathy if we want to create meaningful, sustainable social change. Empathic action requires us to confront social injustices not as spectators, but as fully involved participants committed to putting an end to indignity and suffering. Sure, empathy predisposes us to being kind and caring and sets the stage for altruistic action, but empathic action makes the moral imperative to act explicit. Now, you may be asking, why do I believe empathic action is so important and so urgent? Because, ladies and gentlemen, we are facing a set of social and environmental crises that are unprecedented in scale, scope, and impact. Gone are the days of simple and straightforward problems. Instead, we are beset by wicked problems. Here are some examples. The inequitable distribution of wealth. Today, there are 11 million millionaires. But at the same time, 60% of the people living on the planet survive on just 6% of the world's income. 1 in 6 goes to bed at night hungry, not having consumed enough food to sustain a baseline of health and well-being. Nearly 1 billion people lack access to safe drinking water, and over 1 billion people practice open defecation without access to sanitation facilities. 100 million children are not in school, 60% of them girls. Meanwhile, hundreds of thousands of kids serve as child soldiers. Approximately 27 million people worldwide are currently being held captive as sex slaves or in some form of bonded labor. That's 3 times the number of people who suffered throughout the 300-year African slave trade. And finally, there's climate change, the most fundamental crisis to ever confront humanity. And why? Because people are unwilling to face the reality that overconsuming finite resources is simply unsustainable. I came across this recently. It's called Politicians Discussing Global Warming by Isaac Cordell. Which brings me back to my point. We need more empathic action. Here's a good example. Meet Daniel Perrette, a former student of mine. He's pretty upset about human trafficking and its prevalence in Canada. He also empathizes with the men and women and children being held against their will and living in servitude. So he's on an empathic action mission to bike from Montreal to Vancouver to raise awareness about the issue and raise funds for a nationwide anti-trafficking registry. And in case the magnitude of his epic journey hasn't quite hit home, let me put it this way. Here's Montreal. It's about 5,500 kilometers to the Netherlands. It's 3,700 kilometers to Vancouver. So Daniel, I know you're on day 12 of this journey. I'm behind you all the way. And now it's time for a final guess what. Engaging in empathic action has positive implications for self and society. It's true, you and everyone else stand to benefit personally by doing so. Once again, neuroscience is proving what we already know intuitively, and that is doing good does the body good. Indeed, being in service to others lights up the same pleasure and reward centers in the brain as does cocaine, heroin, and even great sex. As an aside, I've recently learned that the makers of ecstasy were originally toying with the idea of naming the drug empathy because of the state of mind it induces, but they didn't think the word was catchy enough. Remarkably, engaging in empathic action also reduces stress, anxiety, and depression. It heightens immune system functioning, elevates self-esteem, improves personal relationships, and even boosts workplace productivity. So what are we all waiting for? In the face of social and environmental injustices, some of us feel rage, some of us feel impotent, others turn a blind eye. So I'd like you to consider these 2 quotes in juxtaposition. Polish poet Stanislaw Lech once wrote, "Each snowflake in an avalanche pleads not guilty." In other words, there are a bunch of snowflakes saying, "Well, I'm not to blame for what's gone wrong, and what could I possibly do to change things?" On the other hand, Italian preacher St. Francis of Assisi believed all the darkness in the world cannot extinguish the light of a single candle, which of course speaks to the power of one. When I share these 2 quotes with my students, I typically get some resistance for being too hopeful, too sentimental, too naive. But then I remind them about the asymptote, which never quite reaches the x-axis but never stops trying. And I remind them of something profound Martin Luther King once said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it always bends towards justice." Despite living in a global village with an extraordinary capacity for interconnectedness, I believe we lack a sense of interdependence, one that's based on empathy. As humans, we all have a deep-seated need to be in communion with one another and in service to one another. So we don't just need an explosion of empathic action to thwart catastrophe, we need it to flourish as human beings. Last April, I attended the Skoll World Forum in Oxford, a gathering of 900 social entrepreneurs from around the world. At this conference, Nobel laureate Muhammad Yunus, who pioneered microfinance, spoke of the incredible feats of science that mankind has witnessed in the past few decades, including space exploration, the internet, and the Human Genome Project. He concluded his talk by saying, "Science fiction leads to science. One has to imagine something before it can be realized. What we lack in the world today is sufficient social fiction." And he's right. Soon enough, we're going to be 9 billion people on this beautiful planet sharing a common destiny. I believe the time has come to leverage the power of empathy and embark upon a global empathic action revolution. Rabbi Hillel once famously said, "If I am not for myself, who will be for me? If I am not for others, what am I? And if not now, when?" In a quiet moment of contemplation, I invite you to ask yourself these same questions. Thank you all very much. Danke wel.
Thank you, Anita. Very